Welcome, and make yourself comfortable. Tonight we step quietly into the world of the Victorians, a world draped in velvet and lit by gas lamps, remembered for its elegance and restraint. But behind those curtains, life for wives was far darker than the portraits and novels ever suggested. Imagine entering a marriage where your name, your property, even your voice no longer belonged to you. Imagine a life corseted not only by fabric, but by law, by custom, and by silence. This is the story history prefers to soften, yet it is one of quiet suffering, hidden endurance, and untold strength. Stay with me as we uncover the truths that lingered in the shadows of Victorian homes, truths that reveal why being a wife in this era was far more brutal than most would ever dare to believe. And if this journey stirs your curiosity, I invite you to walk with me again. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me which parts of history you long to explore next, and together we will breathe life into the forgotten voices of the past. And so, let us begin where all of it began for a woman of that time at the altar. The moment she stood beneath the church bells and whispered her vows, she was no longer simply a woman. She was transformed, not into an equal partner, but into a possession. This is where the marriage trap closed its iron gate. The bells rang brightly, but for many women, each toll was the sealing of a contract they could never escape. Marriage in the Victorian age was celebrated as the pinnacle of a woman's life, yet it was also the first step into an existence defined by limitation. The vows, wrapped in poetic words, concealed the harshness of law. Under the doctrine of coverture, a wife's legal identity was erased. Her wages, her land, her inheritance, all dissolved into the hands of her husband. Even her children were not hers in the eyes of the courts. The jurist William Blackstone had written a century earlier that the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage. Victorian lawmakers did little to change this, and in some ways enforced it even more tightly. For many brides, love was not the reason they entered into marriage at all. Some were guided by family arrangements, others by financial necessity, and many by the terrifying alternative, spinsterhood. To remain unmarried was to risk poverty, dependence on reluctant relatives, or a lifetime of ill-paid labor. Governesses, seamstresses, shop girls, all earned barely enough to survive. A husband promised stability, a roof, a place in society, but the price of that stability was freedom, and once given, it could not easily be reclaimed. Divorce, in theory, existed, but in practice it was nearly impossible. Until the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, divorces required a private act of Parliament, an expensive and humiliating process reserved for the wealthy. Even after reform, the law was stacked against wives. A husband could divorce his wife on the grounds of adultery alone. A wife, however, had to prove not only adultery, but additional cruelty or desertion, often with witnesses willing to speak in open court. Few dared, for the shame was public and lasting. Custody of children almost always went to the husband. To leave was to lose everything: reputation, children, livelihood, and so the trap held firm. The role of angel of the house was praised in sermons, novels, and magazines. All but behind its sweetness was a demand for self-erasure. A wife was expected to embody purity, obedience, and quiet sacrifice. She was to serve as the moral heart of the family, yet she had no voice in shaping the laws that governed her life. If she complained, she was ungrateful. If she resisted, she was unnatural. Respectability was not just a standard, it was a weapon. Neighbors watched, churches whispered, and society judged. A single rumor could stain a woman's name beyond repair. The home itself became both sanctuary and prison. For wealthy wives, it was a stage, polished and decorated, to reflect their husband's status. They supervised servants, entertained guests, played music, and raised children, all while remaining enclosed within their drawing rooms. For working wives, it was harder still. Crowded rooms in soot-stained neighborhoods, dawn to dusk labor, scrubbing floors, carrying water, sewing until eyes ached. Whether rich or poor, the bars of the marriage trap were the same, only gilded for some and rusted for others. The marriage bed offered no release. Consent did not exist in law between husband and wife. A wife's body was considered her husband's right, and marital rape was not a crime. One judge in the 19th century declared that by marriage, a wife had given irrevocable consent to sexual relations. Pregnancy followed pregnancy, each one a gamble with death. Maternal mortality rates were staggering. Infections, hemorrhages, and complications ended countless lives. Doctors often dismissed women's pain as weakness or hysteria, prescribing opium, rest cures, or even confinement in asylums, rather than acknowledging the brutality of their suffering. Court cases revealed the cruelty behind the curtain. In 1858, the case of Crampton vs. Crampton horrified the public. Mrs. Crampton sought separation, citing years of abuse. The court acknowledged her husband's violence, but still warned against undermining the sacred bond of marriage. In other cases, wives testified of beatings, abandonment, and humiliation, only to be sent back with little protection. The law guarded the institution of marriage more fiercely than the women trapped within it. And yet, in diaries and letters, a different story quietly unfolded. Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote of the suffocation of women's lives, hiding her words within poetry. Lesser-known wives wrote in private journals about longing for education, about the exhaustion of endless pregnancies, about the despair of having no rights to their own children. These writings, often never intended for public eyes, reveal a chorus of silent resistance. Each word was a small act of defiance, proof that they knew the injustice of their condition, even if society refused to hear it. Some wives found ways to bend the rules. A seamstress might hide a few shillings in the lining of a garment, saving against the day of desperation. A merchant's wife might join a reading circle under the guise of social duty, slipping into the world of ideas and reform. Others supported the early suffrage movement, risking ridicule by attending meetings in rented halls where pamphlets were passed hand to hand. Every hidden coin, every whispered conversation, every secret book was a quiet crack in the walls of the trap. The marriage trap was not simply a private hardship. It was the foundation of Victorian society. Men's authority in the home reflected their authority in the nation. To question the first was to destabilize the second, and so, even when reform crept slowly forward, the Custody of Infants Act of 1839, which allowed some mothers to petition for custody of young children, the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882, which gradually restored a wife's right to her earnings and inheritance. These changes were resisted fiercely. Each concession was fought for with years of debate, pamphlets, petitions, and ridicule. The fact that such basic rights had to be clawed from the hands of Parliament is testament to how tight the trap had been set. Still, even in the darkest silence, endurance itself became resistance. A wife who survived another pregnancy, who kept her children clothed, who carried the weight of reputation day after day, was not only enduring, but defying the crushing expectations laid upon her. And in time, the murmurs became movements, the diaries became manifestos, the hidden coins became funding for campaigns. The trap remained, but its bars began to weaken, one small crack at a time. So the Victorian wife smiled when she must, bowed her head when required, and endured the unendurable. Yet within her silence was a strength history too often forgets. It was the strength to survive captivity without surrendering the soul, to carry pain without erasing dignity, and to endure with a quiet fire that would one day ignite change. The marriage trap was brutal, but even cages cannot silence the human spirit forever. The door closes softly behind her, and the outside world disappears. For the Victorian wife, the home was both her kingdom and her cage. From the polished brass of a wealthy townhouse to the soot-stained walls of a cramped tenement, the house defined her existence. It was the space she was told to rule, yet the very walls kept her contained. Respectability meant being seen as the guardian of domestic virtue, the angel of the house. But angels were expected to remain in their assigned heavens. To cross the threshold too often, to seek too much of the world beyond, was to risk whispers of neglect, scandal, or worse. The daily rhythm of her life was relentless, shaped by duty. From the moment she rose, a working-class wife rose with the grey light, often before her husband, to carry water from the pump, to scrub clothes in basins that blistered her hands, to prepare meals from whatever scraps could be afforded. The coal stove smoked, the floorboards needed constant sweeping, and children tugged at her skirts with endless needs. She carried laundry to wash-houses, where steam scalded her lungs, and returned home to sew by candlelight, her eyes burning. This was not the poetic domestic sphere described in sermons, but an endless cycle of toil her body spent before she had lived half her years. For the wives of wealthier households, the burdens were gilded, but no less heavy. Their homes became stages, every room arranged to reflect their husband's standing. They supervised servants, oversaw dinners, entertained visitors, and kept themselves polished like porcelain figures. Letters from the time tell of women so overwhelmed by the pressure of hosting and maintaining appearances that they collapsed into fainting spells. "I am exhausted by the round of callers," one middle-class wife confessed in a private diary in 1873, "and yet, to decline them would shame my husband. I fear I live only to be looked at, never to be seen." In such words we hear the subtle difference between visibility and recognition. Wives were constantly visible, but rarely acknowledged as whole people. Even leisure was a prison of its own. Needlework, piano practice, embroidery, these were not simply hobbies but duties, visible signs of virtue and discipline. A wife who spent too much time reading, especially novels or reformist pamphlets, risked accusations of idleness or subversion. Knowledge was considered dangerous if it traveled too far beyond cookery and child-rearing. In 1860, a periodical warned husbands that books of speculation unsettle a wife's proper mind and render her restless in her place. The library, a door just down the hall, remained closed for many women, its volumes guarded as if ideas themselves might be infectious. And yet within these homes, the silence of suffering echoed. In crowded rooms, children coughed through winters, their fevers untreatable by the remedies of the time. Mothers buried infants and returned quickly to their chores, grief absorbed into duty, because mourning was not considered useful labor. Wealthy wives, isolated in drawing rooms, sometimes wrote letters to friends confessing loneliness so deep it felt like suffocation. They were surrounded by servants, gifts, finery, yet deprived of genuine companionship, trapped in marriages that demanded presence without affection. Medicine, too, conspired against them. The word hysteria hung over wives like a cloud, a convenient label for almost any distress. A wife who fainted from the pressure of corsets, who grew anxious from endless pregnancies, or who slipped into despair at her confinement, could all be branded hysterical. Doctors prescribed silence, bed rest, or the infamous rest cure. Isolation in dimly lit rooms, denied books, conversation, or stimulation. Charlotte Perkins Gilman would later describe the horror of this in her 1892 story, The Yellow Wallpaper, inspired by her own experience with the rest cure. What she wrote in fiction had already been the reality for countless wives who suffered in silence, their homes turned into sick rooms where the very walls seemed to press closer each day. The walls themselves seemed to enforce obedience, curtains drawn to keep out soot, and stairs also dimmed the light of freedom. The hearth, the symbol of domestic warmth, became a tether to endless labor. Even windows, framed with lace, reflected her back at herself, as though reminding her that she could look out, but not step out. As one frustrated wife wrote in a diary fragment, now preserved in a provincial archive, "I see the world pass my window, yet it is barred to me as surely as if iron stood there. My husband says I have all I need within these walls. He cannot see that it is myself that is missing." Still, within these walls, wives carved out secret corners of resistance. A poor wife might hide pennies in a jar tucked beneath floorboards, a fragile safety against hunger. A wealthier wife might disguise reformist tracts within her embroidery basket, reading them in snatched moments while pretending to stitch. Some wrote in diaries by candlelight, careful to lock them away, recording the truth of lives that society preferred to pretend were content. These quiet acts were not enough to shatter the prison, but they kept alive the knowledge that the prison existed. And yet the prison endured because it was invisible to those who did not live within it. Visitors admired tidy parlors, polished floors, obedient children. Ministers praised women for their domestic virtue. Authors wrote sentimental tales of devoted wives who found happiness in sacrifice. To question this illusion was to appear unnatural, even ungrateful. The prison remained because it was disguised as paradise, because the very suffering it created was recast as virtue. So she kept her posture straight, her smile practiced, her words measured, whether she rose in the morning to the clang of factory bells or to the delicate chime of a drawing-room clock. Her life belonged to the house. It consumed her time, her labor, her body, her dreams. It praised her as the heart of the home, while binding her within its walls. And night after night, as the curtains were drawn and the lamps dimmed, countless Victorian wives lay awake with the same unspoken thought, that this house, this gilded or crumbling cage, was never fully hers. It was his. And yet through endurance, they preserved something that could not be stolen. Beneath the silence lived a quiet strength. The domestic prison was meant to erase them, transform their lives into nothing more than shadows cast behind curtains. But even shadows hold shape, even silence carries weight. And in that endurance, wives kept alive the possibility that one day the walls would crack and the prison would no longer hold. The house was her cage. The cage reached deeper than its walls. It reached into her body, into her desires, into the most intimate parts of her life, where even silence could not hide the truth. For a Victorian wife, domestic duty did not end with mending and cleaning. It followed her into the bedroom, into the sick room, into the cradle and the grave. Here, in the most private chambers of life, the burdens became heaviest of all. Motherhood was not a choice, but a destiny. From the moment vows were spoken, a wife was expected to bear children, to prove her worth in the cries of infants and the continuation of her husband's line. Yet, each pregnancy was a crossing into danger. Childbirth was a constant shadow, praised as sacred but fraught with risk. Maternal mortality loomed in every home. Fever, hemorrhage, infection, any of them capable of turning joy into mourning within days. Countless women died before their 40th year, worn thin by repeated confinements. Those who survived carried the scars, bodies weakened, spirits strained, hearts broken by the loss of infants who never lived to walk or speak. Infant mortality was as familiar as the tolling of church bells. Mothers learned to hold their children lightly, not from lack of love, but from necessity, for fevers, coughs, and epidemics claimed so many young lives. A mother might bury 2, 3, even more little coffins, and still be expected to rise the next day and resume her duties. Grief was absorbed into silence, for lamenting too loudly was considered unseemly. Her worth was measured not by the depth of her mourning, but by her willingness to conceive again. This endless cycle eroded not only her body, but her relationship to intimacy itself. Affection with her husband was shadowed by dread, what others called marital duty. She often felt as looming confinement, yet society recognized no right of refusal. Consent was not hers to give or withhold. By law, her body belonged to her husband. Courts echoed centuries-old precedents, declaring that in marriage, a woman gave herself irrevocably. The word rape was never allowed to enter the conversation between husband and wife. What took place in the marriage bed was invisible to the law, even when it left women broken in silence. Desire itself was branded as shameful. Wives were expected to embody purity, to approach intimacy only as duty, never as longing. A woman who admitted to passion risked ridicule, suspicion, or worse. Medical texts warned that female desire was unnatural, a weakness of mind, a threat to morality. Doctors lectured that a proper woman experienced little pleasure in intimacy, that her role was to endure, not to enjoy. Wives who spoke of their own bodies were silenced, dismissed as immodest or unbalanced. Even their suffering was recast as illness. A woman who resisted her husband too strongly might be diagnosed with hysteria, her reluctance treated as disorder, rather than as the natural cry of autonomy denied. The hypocrisy was glaring. While wives were bound by chastity and silence, husbands often moved freely through the shadows of society. Brothels flourished in every Victorian city, tolerated even as wives were confined to angelic ideals. Venereal disease spread from these hidden liaisons into respectable homes, passed silently to wives who bore the consequences without knowledge or defense. Doctors often refused to name the source of these infections, preserving a husband's reputation at the expense of his wife's health. In this way, morality itself was split in two: indulgence for men, denial for women. And yet, beneath this repression, desire did not vanish. It slipped into letters, into novels, into whispered confidences between friends. Some wives confessed in diaries their hunger for tenderness, for affection that was more than duty. I longed to be more than a vessel, one wrote in 1872. I longed to be seen. These were dangerous words, never meant for public eyes, but they reveal a truth history preferred to forget. Victorian wives were not passionless creatures. They were human, with bodies and desires of their own, silenced only by the weight of law and convention. The repression was so thorough that even women themselves sometimes believed it. Many internalized the doctrine of purity, convinced that to desire was to fall short of the ideal. But others, quietly, began to question. They read medical pamphlets that hinted at double standards, novels that suggested women could feel as deeply as men. They joined discussions in hushed corners of reformist circles where sexuality and rights were spoken of in voices barely above whispers. Their resistance was not loud, but it was there, alive in the shadows. Thus, the domestic prison was not only a matter of walls and curtains. It was a prison that lived in the body, in the cycles of birth and loss, in the silence of the bedroom, in the erasure of desire. It was the most intimate captivity, one that left no public record but shaped every heartbeat of a wife's life. And yet, the prison of the body could not be fully separated from the prison of the soul. If childbirth wore her body, and shame silenced her desire, morality itself, the codes of virtue and purity, pressed into every breath, shaped her mind into obedience. The corset she laced each morning was only a symbol of the greater corset she wore within, the tightening grip of expectation, the unyielding demand to be pure, silent, and patient. It is to this corset of morality, unseen but omnipresent, that we must now turn. It is here, in the quiet weight of silence and expectation, that we begin to see how deeply morality itself bound Victorian wives. If the walls of the house confined their bodies, it was the codes of purity and virtue that confined their souls. To understand the prison fully, we must now step into the corset of morality that shaped every breath they took. From the moment she rose and laced her body into fabric and bone, a Victorian wife carried morality, not as a choice, but as a burden, stitched into her very being. The corset itself, drawn tight until the ribs strained and the lungs compressed, was more than fashion. It was a symbol of control, of virtue imposed through discipline. A narrow waist was admired as evidence of refinement, and so women endured shallow breathing, fainting spells, even dislocated ribs, all for the sake of embodying society's image of purity. The corset was not just around the body, it lived inside the mind. Every glance in a mirror, every whisper of gossip, reminded her that her virtue was always under surveillance. Purity was her crown, but it was a crown made of thorns. A wife was expected to be the guardian of morality, the angel who held her family above temptation. Yet her husband was granted indulgence, excused for his straying, while her smallest slip could ruin her forever. A single rumor of impropriety could strip her of respectability. If a man engaged in affairs, it was a private failing. If a wife so much as entertained suspicion, it was social death. The double standard was so deeply woven into the era that many women internalized it, turning their own desires into shame and their silence into duty. Literature and sermons reinforced this relentless ideal. Popular magazines declared that a wife's noblest calling was submission, that her purity was the foundation upon which her husband's respect rested. Preachers thundered from pulpits that women who strayed from their place endangered not only their families, but the moral order of society itself. Even novels, those widely read companions of Victorian evenings, painted heroines whose virtue was tested and rewarded only when they endured suffering in silence. Morality was both script and cage, written into the stories that women absorbed and passed on. Yet the most dangerous part of this corset of morality was how it reached beyond behavior into the realm of thought. A wife was judged not only for what she did, but for what she seemed to be. Her tone of voice, her gaze, her laughter, all could be scrutinized for signs of impropriety. Women who expressed strong opinions risked being branded unfeminine. Those who showed interest in politics or reform risked ridicule. Even the pursuit of knowledge could be suspect. An overeducated woman is rarely a good wife. One popular tract warned in 1865. Such warnings worked like invisible laces, tightening around the mind until ambition itself felt improper. Medicine joined morality in enforcing silence. Doctors diagnosed wives who resisted these expectations with nervous disorders, branding them hysterical, melancholic, or unstable. Treatments often involved further restraint, isolation, sedatives, denial of stimulation. Some women, broken by these practices, withdrew into lifeless obedience. Others resisted quietly, enduring labels of fragility while cultivating private strength. Their refusal to be erased, though often invisible, was itself a rebellion against the morality that sought to bind them. The corset of morality was not always resisted openly. Many women, deprived of avenues for expression, turned inward, keeping diaries where they confessed thoughts forbidden in the parlor. "I am weary of being always pure in the eyes of others," wrote one wife in 1878. "I long to be human, to be flawed, to speak my heart, yet I dare not." Such fragments, fragile on yellowed paper, revealed that beneath the appearance of obedience, women knew their condition was unjust. They felt the suffocation and recorded it, even if only for themselves. And yet morality's power was so pervasive, even resistance carried risk. Wives who confided too freely were betrayed by gossip. Women who sought companionship beyond the marriage bond were destroyed by scandal. Those who pressed for reform were mocked as unwomanly, their femininity questioned, their reputations shredded. It was not only husbands who enforced the corset, but neighbors, preachers, mothers, and even other wives, who, bound by the same cage, became its guardians. But despite this, cracks began to appear. The very pressure of the moral corset made its cruelty visible. Some women, emboldened by education or the suffrage movement, began to challenge the script. Pamphlets circulated, written by anonymous wives, who dared to suggest that purity and morality should not be chains but choices. Court cases, whispered about in newspapers, revealed the double standards so clearly that even some men began to question them, and within drawing rooms, behind closed curtains, conversations grew more daring, more questioning. The corset of morality could be endured for only so long before the breath itself demanded release. For the Victorian wife, morality was both shield and shackle. It granted her a place of honor, but stripped her of freedom. It demanded she embody perfection, but denied her humanity. Yet within that contradiction lay the seeds of change. The corset could tighten, but it could not extinguish the quiet fire within. And as that fire grew, it prepared the way for women who would, in time, unlace the bindings and claim their right to breathe freely. And so, as we leave behind the silent weight of morality, we must step into another realm where the brutality became more visible, less hidden by lace or sermon. If morality shaped the mind, it was law and medicine that bound the body most directly. To see the full extent of the Victorian wife's captivity, we must now turn to the courts, the sick rooms, and the physicians' ledgers, where the true brutality of law and medicine is revealed. And so, as we leave behind the silent weight of morality, we must step into another realm, where the brutality became more visible, less hidden by lace or sermon. If morality shaped the mind, it was law and medicine that bound the body most directly. To see the full extent of the Victorian wife's captivity, we must now turn to the courts, the sick rooms, and the physicians' ledgers, where the true brutality of law and medicine is revealed. The law of the land, written in cold ink on parliamentary rolls, declared marriage sacred, but sacredness did not mean safety. Under the doctrine of coverture, a wife ceased to exist in the eyes of the courts as an individual. She could not own property, sign contracts, or even claim wages she had earned. If she inherited money, it immediately became her husband's. If she wrote a book, the profits were his. Even the children she bore were legally his alone. Should a marriage crumble, the courts were no refuge. Divorce was technically possible, but the odds were stacked cruelly against wives. Before 1857, dissolving a marriage required a private act of parliament, a costly and humiliating process that only the wealthy could attempt. After the Matrimonial Causes Act, divorce became slightly more accessible, but still unequal. A husband could divorce his wife for adultery alone, while a wife had to prove not just adultery, but also cruelty, desertion, or other grave offenses. In practice, this meant that countless women endured abuse in silence, knowing that to seek escape was to invite ruin. Courtrooms became theaters of humiliation for those few who dared. The press reported every sordid detail, branding women with scandal that clung for life. In 1864, Mrs. Norton, poet and socialite, fought publicly for her rights after her husband seized her earnings and denied her custody of their children. Though admired in literary circles, she discovered that the law saw her only as a wife, a shadow of her husband. She wrote bitterly of her plight, declaring that an English wife may not leave her husband's house, Not only can he sue her, but he can imprison her body. Her case stirred debate, but for most wives, the law remained unyielding. Inside the home, the law's shadow reached into the most intimate spaces. The notion of marital rape was not recognized. A wife's body was legally her husband's to command. Judges cited centuries-old precedent that by marriage, a woman gave irrevocable consent to her husband. There was no crime in forcing her. There was only duty. In silence and shame, wives endured violations that left no record in court, but scarred the body and the spirit alike. If the courts offered no mercy, medicine provided little comfort. The Victorian wife's body was a battlefield, and doctors were often less healers than enforcers of convention. Childbirth loomed as one of the greatest dangers. Maternal mortality rates were staggering. Infection, hemorrhage, and complications claimed thousands of lives. The antiseptic revolution had not yet fully arrived, and childbirth was often managed with unwashed hands and unsterilized instruments. To marry was to risk death with each pregnancy, yet contraception was both unreliable and condemned as immoral. Many wives endured a rhythm of pregnancies that drained them, bodies worn thin long before their time. Those who broke under the strain were rarely met with compassion. Instead, they were labeled with that most Victorian of diagnoses: hysteria, anxiety, exhaustion, postnatal depression. All was swept under this vague term. The treatment was rarely healing. Physicians prescribed the rest cure, a regime of isolation, enforced bed rest, denial of reading, writing, or conversation. A woman who sought stimulation or expression was told to silence her mind. Charlotte Perkins Gilman would later immortalize the horror of this treatment in her haunting tale. The yellow wallpaper, though fictionalized, it echoed reality. Countless wives lying in dim rooms, stripped of activity, their despair deepened under the guise of medicine. For those deemed more troublesome, asylums beckoned. Husbands could have wives committed with shocking ease, citing hysteria, melancholy, or disobedience. Reports from asylums reveal wards filled with women who had been inconvenient at home, locked away under diagnoses that masked social control. One inspector, in 1870, noted with unease how many of the female patients had been admitted, not for madness, but for domestic discontent. The walls of these institutions became another prison, sanctioned by law, justified by medicine. And yet, even within this brutality, voices emerged to challenge the system. Reformers like Caroline Norton and later campaigners for women's rights drew public attention to the cruelty of coverture and the injustice of custody laws. Medical reformers, too, began to question the broad use of hysteria as a diagnosis, pointing to the real physical and psychological suffering women endured. Slowly, Acts of Parliament chipped away at the edifice. The Custody of Infants Act of 1839, the Married Women's Property Acts, 1870, and 1882, each a small breach in the wall of male authority. But for countless wives, these reforms came too late to ease their own suffering. The brutality of law and medicine was not always visible to the outside world. To neighbors and friends, a wife seemed comfortable, her house in order, her children tidy. But behind closed doors, she bore the weight of laws that erased her and medicine that silenced her. Each petition rejected, each diagnosis delivered, each confinement endured, all of it revealed how profoundly the Victorian wife was trapped, not only by her husband, but by the very institutions that were supposed to protect her. And yet, beneath this system, a quiet resistance grew. Wives wrote letters that circulated In reformist circles, they whispered to daughters, urging them to demand more. They joined the early suffrage movement, standing in the cold outside Parliament with banners in hand. The law was brutal, medicine was blind, but women themselves were neither. Their endurance became the ground on which future generations would build. So we leave the echo of courtrooms and the dim corridors of asylums, the legal documents and the physicians' ledgers, and return to the quiet spaces where wives themselves spoke in voices hushed but unbroken. For even in silence they dreamed, and it is to these voices of hidden resistance, the letters, the diaries, the secret acts of courage, that we must now turn. So we leave the echo of courtrooms and the dim corridors of asylums, the legal documents and the physicians' ledgers, and return to the quiet spaces where wives themselves spoke in voices hushed but unbroken. For even in silence, they dreamed, and it is to these voices of hidden resistance, the letters, the diaries, the secret acts of courage, that we must now turn. In parlors lit by flickering lamps, when the house was finally still, a wife might unlock a drawer and draw out a diary bound in plain leather. Its pages, yellowed with time, bore words that no one else would ever read. Here she could confess what could never be spoken aloud: her frustration, her loneliness, her secret hopes. "I have been silent all day," wrote one wife in 1869, "and silence has become my second nature. But here, in ink, I can speak." These diaries became the hidden chambers of women's lives, repositories of truth in a world that demanded silence. Letters, too, carried the spark of resistance. Some were sent between trusted friends, carefully worded to avoid scandal. Yet beneath the polite phrases lay messages of solidarity. Wives confided in each other about their struggles with domineering husbands, their fears in childbirth, their grief over lost children. These letters formed a network of whispered strength, threads of connection woven across towns and counties. A few even slipped beyond private correspondence into the realm of reform. In the 1850s and 1860s, letters by Caroline Norton and other outspoken wives were published in newspapers and pamphlets, shaking polite society by exposing the cruelty hidden within respectable homes. There were also acts of quiet rebellion that left no words behind, only traces. A seamstress wife might hide a coin in the hem of a garment she stitched, a tiny reserve of independence. A merchant's wife might leave the parlor early, feigning a headache, only to retreat to her room and read a pamphlet on women's rights by lamplight, her heart racing with every page. A mother might whisper to her daughter that she must learn to value her own mind, even if the world told her otherwise. These were not grand gestures, but they were acts of survival, ways of holding on to a self that society tried to erase. The suffrage movement, still fragile in its infancy, offered another outlet. Though dangerous to reputations, some wives joined meetings held in modest halls, their attendance hidden behind excuses of errands or social calls. There they found themselves among other women who shared their grievances, who spoke of change not as an impossible dream, but as a cause worth struggling for. Pamphlets were passed hand to hand, speeches given in trembling voices, petitions signed with cautious but determined hands. The world might dismiss them as radicals, but to the wives who attended, these gatherings were glimpses of a future where silence was no longer required. Literature also became a subtle form of rebellion. Writers like Elizabeth Barrett Browning and later George Eliot infused their works with questions about women's roles, disguised within poetry and fiction. Wives who read their words by lamplight found themselves reflected, their frustrations given voice through characters and verse. Even novels that outwardly praised obedience often contained undercurrents of resistance, coded messages that observant women could recognize. Books became both solace and weapon, a reminder that they were not alone in their struggle. Yet resistance was not always external. Sometimes it lived only within the quiet decision to endure without surrendering the soul. A wife who managed to survive another dangerous childbirth, who held her children close despite the threat of losing them to law, who found moments of joy in gardens or music, despite the weight of duty. She was resisting. Every day she lived with dignity in a world that sought to strip it from her. She was fighting back. Endurance itself became defiance. Survival itself a refusal to be erased. The world outside was slow to notice. Newspapers continued to print sentimental tales of happy wives. Ministers continued to preach submission. Doctors continued to diagnose hysteria. But beneath this surface, change was stirring. Each diary entry, each whispered letter, each meeting in a rented hall added to a tide that would, in time, reshape society. The hidden resistance of wives may not have shattered the prison in their lifetimes, but it cracked the walls, making space for the daughters and granddaughters who would push them wider. As the century turned, laws began to shift. The Married Women's Property Acts gave wives control over earnings and inheritance. Custody laws began to consider mothers' rights. The suffrage movement grew louder, no longer confined to whispers. The voices that had been silenced for so long began, at last, to be heard. But we must not forget the countless wives whose names were never recorded, whose resistance was never documented, whose strength lived only in the shadows. They too were part of this hidden chorus, and without them, change could never have come. So in the end, the Victorian wife was not only a victim of silence, but also its keeper, its transformer, its quiet challenger. She endured what could not be spoken, but in her endurance, she planted the seeds of rebellion. Her silence was never empty. It carried weight. It carried memory. It carried the promise that one day, the voices of women would no longer be hidden, but would rise in full. And as the gaslight fades and the curtain falls on these hidden lives, we step back and see the full picture. Marriage as a trap, the home as a prison, morality as a corset, law and medicine as shackles, but also wives as survivors, as dreamers, as quiet rebels. Their world was brutal, but their endurance was extraordinary, and their whispers, carried through time, still reach us now. The house may have confined her, the laws may have erased her, but the wife's hands were never still. Work filled every moment of her day, and yet her labor was invisible, her contributions unacknowledged, her name absent from every ledger and every wage book. The Victorian wife was indispensable to the machinery of family, economy, and society, and yet she was treated as if she had done nothing at all. In working-class homes, wives rose before dawn to stoke fires, sweep hearths, and prepare what little food could be stretched across hungry mouths. They washed clothes in cold water that chafed skin raw, carried buckets from pumps until shoulders ached, and stitched by candlelight until eyes blurred. They took in laundry, mended for neighbors, even cleaned for wealthier households, earning pennies that passed directly to their husbands, for the law gave them no claim to wages. They managed budgets so tight they could not waste a crumb of bread, keeping families afloat through skill and sacrifice. Yet in census records, in reports, they were listed as doing nothing. Middle and upper-class wives labored too. Though their work was wrapped in gentility, they supervised servants, managed estates, organized meals, kept accounts, and performed the endless social duties expected of their station. Every dinner party was a project of planning, every household an enterprise requiring her oversight. She bore the pressure of reputation. A badly kept home was seen, not as her husband's failure, but hers. Still, no one called it work. She was praised for accomplishments, not recognized for management, her unpaid labor dismissed as leisure. Beyond the walls of the home, wives often contributed directly to their husbands' businesses, Shopkeepers' wives stood behind counters. Farm wives worked in fields. Innkeepers' wives managed guests. Yet their efforts were recorded under the husband's name alone: a farmer's prosperity, a merchant's success, a craftsman's steady trade. All bore the invisible fingerprints of wives whose efforts were erased. Even when wives devised strategies, balanced books, or managed workers, the credit flowed upward, as if their labor were naturally an extension of his. The hypocrisy deepened in law and policy. A man's earnings were legally his, but a wife's were his as well. Even if she worked in factories or as a seamstress, her pay passed into his pocket. She could labor for hours in dim workshops sewing dresses that would grace the salons of wealth, yet she was told she had no occupation. Reports of the time dismissed wives as dependent, ignoring the reality that their survival often depended on their work. Hidden, unrecorded, but relentless. The cost was not only physical, but spiritual: to labor without recognition, to give without acknowledgement, eroded the sense of self. Many wives recorded in diaries the bitterness of invisibility. "I work every waking hour, and still they call me idle," one woman wrote in 1874. Another confessed, "He goes to the shop each morning, but I rise earlier, sleep later, and still my hands are unseen." These voices, though rare in the official record, reveal the silent despair of women who knew their worth was denied. Yet in this invisibility lay a paradoxical strength. Wives became masters of survival, stretching meager resources, keeping households together under impossible strain. Their skills in budgeting, sewing, healing, and managing were profound. Even if no one cared to acknowledge them, they trained daughters to do the same, passing knowledge from hand to hand, preserving families in ways that cannot be measured by wages or records. Their work sustained entire communities, even while society pretended they did nothing. By the late century, reformers began to draw attention to this contradiction. Campaigners for women's rights pointed to the injustice of calling wives idle while they labored without pay. Debates arose in Parliament about women's property rights, about the injustice of denying them earnings they themselves created. Slowly, change crept forward. The Married Women's Property Acts gave wives a claim to their income, though recognition came decades too late for countless women whose lives had already been spent in unacknowledged toil. And yet, even with reforms, the deeper truth remained. Victorian society depended on the hidden labor of wives, even as it denied them honor for it. Their work was essential, but their names were erased. Their strength carried households, but history wrote them out. The Victorian wife's day was endless work, but work without recognition. She scrubbed, mended, balanced, endured, and then was told she had done nothing at all. In this erasure lies one of the cruelest truths of the era, that the very hands that sustained the age were left invisible, folded into silence. And still, those hands did not falter. They carried families through hardship. They built the foundation upon which change would rise. And they remind us, even now, that labor unacknowledged is not labor undone. Change rarely arrives with thunder. It begins in whispers, in moments so quiet that the world scarcely notices. And so it was for Victorian wives, whose silent endurance slowly began to feed a current of transformation. Out of drawing rooms and parlors, out of letters and pamphlets, out of suffrage halls and even court cases, came the early signs that the cage might one day be broken. The first stirrings came through the written word. Pamphlets circulated that dared to suggest women were not merely angels of the house, but citizens of a nation. Writers like Harriet Martineau and Frances Power Cobb addressed audiences with arguments that combined logic with passion, questioning why women should be denied rights that men took for granted. Novels, too, became unexpected weapons. George Eliot's Middlemarch and Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre offered not only entertainment, but reflections of women's inner lives, their struggles against control, and their yearning for freedom. Wives read these books in secret, hearts quickened by the recognition of their own experience, rendered in fiction. In cities, the suffrage movement gathered strength. Small meetings in rented halls grew into marches and petitions. Women signed their names to documents demanding representation, an act that to many felt revolutionary. The first petition for women's suffrage was presented to Parliament in 1866, signed by over 1,500 women. Among them were wives who risked their reputations, who knew that even the act of adding their names could mark them as radicals. Yet the signatures multiplied, proof that the silence was cracking. Reform also came through unlikely allies. Some male reformers, witnessing the injustices endured by their wives and daughters, lent their voices to the cause. Lawyers and physicians, who saw the cruelty of custody laws or the futility of hysteria diagnoses, began to question long-held assumptions. These were not yet mass movements, but they were seeds planted in soil, long hardened by tradition. The industrial age itself reshaped the conversation. As factories expanded and women entered the workforce in greater numbers, the myth of the idle wife grew harder to sustain. Women stood at looms, assembled goods, worked in offices as typists and clerks, their labor undeniable, even if their pay was meager. The contradiction between their visible work and their legal invisibility sharpened the debate. Reformers pointed to these women as evidence that the old order no longer matched reality. Even art began to rebel. Painters like Emily Mary Osborne captured the plight of governesses and solitary women, highlighting their vulnerability in a society that offered little security outside of marriage. Satirical cartoons in popular papers mocked the hypocrisy of politicians who denied women rights while benefiting from their labor. Slowly, culture itself began to turn. And then there were the scandals that broke through polite society. Stories too striking to be ignored. Trials of abusive husbands, public debates over child custody, controversies about venereal disease transmitted to wives by their unfaithful spouses. These moments shocked audiences who preferred to believe in the perfection of domestic life. Each scandal was a fissure in the facade, proof that beneath the polished veneer lay truths too brutal to ignore. Resistance also took unexpected forms. Women formed temperance societies, campaigning against the ruin brought by alcohol. Though not always labeled as feminist, these movements gave wives a public voice, an organized platform through which they could demand change for the sake of families. Charity work, too, became a channel of empowerment. Wives who organized relief for the poor or established schools for girls found themselves stepping into leadership roles that society had long denied them. Through these roles, they gained confidence, influence, and a glimpse of what wider participation could mean. These whispers of change did not yet overturn the order, but they shifted it. Laws followed, slowly and reluctantly. Custody rights for mothers, property rights for wives, reforms in divorce law. Each act was small, often partial, but each chipped away at the foundation of a system that had seemed immovable. And yet the most profound change was not in Parliament or in the press, but in the minds of women themselves. Wives who once believed they had no choice began to imagine that they might. Daughters who watched their mothers suffer began to dream of different futures. Silence remained heavy, but within it, new words were forming. Words of rights, equality, and dignity. The whispers of change were fragile, vulnerable to ridicule and backlash, but they endured. Like cracks in stone, they widened slowly, letting light into places long kept dark. And through them, wives glimpsed for the first time that the world could be otherwise, that the prison was not eternal, that their lives were not fated to vanish in silence. And as the century waned, those whispers grew into voices, and voices into movements. What had begun in secrecy and shame became banners raised in public squares. But before the banners, before the marches, there were the wives who whispered, who endured, who dreamed in silence. They were the beginning of change, the first breaths of freedom in a world still heavy with chains. The gaslight dims now, and the heavy curtains of the Victorian home draw closed. The wives we have followed through parlors, sick rooms, courtrooms, and secret diaries slip back into shadow. Their world was brutal, yes, but it was also enduring. They carried silence like a weight, but within that silence was a strength that history has too often forgotten. Think of the hands that stitched by candlelight, unseen in ledgers yet keeping families alive. Think of the hearts that buried children and still found the will to rise the next morning. Think of the voices that were hushed in public, yet whispered in diaries, letters, secret circles, keeping alive the idea that women were more than what society allowed them to be. These wives were not only survivors of their time, they were keepers of possibility. Their strength was not measured in victories won within their lifetimes, but in the foundations they laid for those who came after. The property rights secured, the custody laws reformed, the votes eventually gained. All of these grew from seeds planted in quiet defiance by women who may never have spoken above a whisper. Every reform that followed carries the fingerprints of wives who endured and refused, even silently, to let their spirits be erased. And if you listen closely, you can still hear them. In the hush of a diary locked away, in the faint ink of petitions long faded, in the quiet grief of a letter never posted, their voices remain. They remind us that silence is not always absence. Sometimes silence is resistance. Sometimes silence is survival. Sometimes silence is the long breath before a cry that will one day break the air. We walk away from the Victorian age with more than pity. We walk away with respect. Respect for women who were denied recognition yet held entire households, entire societies together. Respect for the way they endured, resisted, and dreamed when the world told them not to. Respect for the legacy they left us. Not only the freedoms we now hold, but the reminder that freedom was never free, and that it was carried on the shoulders of countless women whose names we will never know. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, carry with you the memory of those wives who lived in silence, but left behind strength. Their lives were brutal, yes, but their endurance was extraordinary, and their whispers, carried across generations, have become the voices we hear today. And if you find yourself moved by their story, you are welcome to walk with me again. Share your thoughts. Tell me what hidden corners of history you wish to explore next, and together we will keep alive the voices of those who were nearly forgotten.